Hey everybody, it's Brandon from Slingshot Sports, and we're here today to talk about an unfortunate side of wind sports, and that is gear damage. Now there are a few ways you can damage your gear, and specifically today we're going to be talking about what happens when you damage the internal bladder of your wing. Now if you're coming from kiteboarding, this may be something you're completely familiar with already. If not, that's totally okay. With a few simple steps and a few simple tools, we can tackle this at almost any beach in the world and get you back on the water winging. So the first step that you need to do when assessing a leaky bladder or leaky wing system is find out where the leak is. And the easiest way to do that is to pump up the wing. You're going to go ahead and clip off the one pump isolation strut valve, and then you're going to let the wing sit for about 45 minutes. And what you're going to try to do is figure out whether the leading edge got soft or the strut got soft, and that's going to give you an indication of where the leak is. In this case, I've already performed this and I saw that the leak is coming from the strut, so we're going to go ahead and pull the strut out and assess it for damage. There are a few short and easy simple steps and a few tools that you're going to need to accomplish this task. You're going to need a pump so that you can pump up your wing. You're going to need a piece of feeder line that is longer than the strut, so you want to go ahead and just measure the line against your strut, one piece of line. And in this case, we're going to have an extra bladder just in case we need to repair the bladder completely or replace it rather than just like throw a patch on there. So we have three things ready to go. So now that we've isolated the strut as the problem, the next thing we're going to need to do is prepare the bladder for removal. And the first step of preparing the bladder for removal is to locate the one pump connection hose, and we need to remove the one pump connection hose from the strut side because we're dealing with the strut. So the first thing is there's a little tab right here. I can use a little flathead screwdriver or my thumbnail. I just need to pull underneath and delodge the clip and pull the clip open, and you can see it comes apart in two pieces. I can go ahead and set that to the side because I'm going to need to reinstall it later, so don't lose this part. Next step, I'm just going to pull the latex tube off of the nozzle, and I'm just going to leave that to the side. Next really important step is I am going to need to push this nozzle inside of the bladder to pull it out, but before I do so, I want to grab my leader or my pull-through line and I want to attach it to the valve head so that once I push the valve head inside of the bladder, I have something attached to it. So all I'm simply going to do is take this line, I'm going to wrap it around the notch in the valve head, and I'm going to tie a simple overhand knot. You just want to tie a knot that you can remove easily, but yet will hold when you pull on this bladder. Okay, now I have my feeder line through. What I'm going to go ahead and do is grab the outer Dacron sleeve, trying to isolate just the Dacron. I'm going to take my thumb and forefinger and I'm going to firmly push the valve into the Dacron sleeve. You'll notice it pushes off the lip, and I'm just going to go ahead and push that completely inside the sleeve of the bladder with my line still attached. My next step is I'm going to come down here to the end of the strut and I'm going to locate the Velcro, which as you can see is indicated by this square patch sewn on the strut. I want to go ahead and put my finger into the cavity and undo the Velcro and pull the tail out of the strut so that I can see the bladder. You can see the bladder itself is right here. Now that I have that removed and I have my valve pushed down in, I've double checked that my feeder line is attached, because once I pull this bladder through, this feeder line needs to come through with it, and I'm simply going to take the tail of the bladder and I'm just going to pull the bladder completely out of the strut. Now, this is a good moment. What I like to do with this feeder line here to solve hassles is I like to make a simple lark's head knot and put it over the harness line attachment so that my line cannot pull into my strut and I don't lose my line. It's just a simple thing to save you some headaches. I can come over here and you can see my line is completely through. I simply need to untie my overhand knot to detach my bladder from my feeding line, and then we can assess the bladder for damage and or replacement. So I have my replacement bladder here. I'm going to go ahead and open up my packaging. Now, there are a couple tricks that are going to help make this bladder install go good, and there's actually instructions in the bladder in case you need visual references in addition to this reference. The first and most important thing is I want to make sure my bladder orientation is correct. So I want to look at my strut. My strut valve that I'm looking at right now is on the left-hand side. So when I get this bladder out, I want to make sure that this strut is actually going to end up going on the left-hand side. The next very important step that you must perform here, in order to get the bladder to fill the full cavity of the head of the strut, you need to turn the bladder on the head inside out. So you just need to pull the bladder apart and force the head of the bladder inside itself until you get to the valve head. So your goal here is that the valve is going to be the highest thing on the bladder, so that when I pull this bladder in from this point, it lodges where it should, and this bladder is going to, when inflated, is going to inflate out of that cavity and fill the head of the strut. So that is a really important step, and one that if you forget can often lead to more damage on your bladder. All right, so now we've got our bladder. We've pushed in our bladder head to ensure that it fills up properly once we install it. We're going to go ahead and fold the bladder kind of flat, and like I said, we know this valve needs to go on the left-hand side of the strut cage, so we're going to set it down as if it was going to go into the strut. So the valve is on the proper side. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do what we call an accordion fold, and that accordion fold is to help the bladder slide in effortlessly and align without twists. This is not something that's super painful on a strut, because a strut is a small bladder replacement, but when you start to have to do a leading edge or something with a longer strut, it does become really important that you manage the bladder going back into the tube in order to reduce your chances of having a twist. So you can see I just folded it over itself, over itself, over itself until I end up with a small little package. I have my valve here. I'm going to go ahead and grab my feeder string, and I'm going to tie it on to my valve head here. Again, you can use an overhand knot, a lark's head knot, a bowline, whatever knot you want to use. You just want to make sure it's secure enough that when you pull on it, it doesn't come off the valve. And now I'm going to start the process of feeding the bladder back up in. So another really important step is to take the really wide head of the bladder and fold it a little bit smaller so that it can feed into the narrow area here. Now, if you are by yourself, you can do this in a pinch, but this is always a great spot to have a friend come in and help you pull on your feeder line so that you can focus 100% on feeding the bladder in. If you do need to do it by yourself, you can kind of do a puppeteer maneuver, but I'm going to have my friend here, Wyatt, step in. He's going to grab the string. We're going to try to keep it really nice and tight, and all you want to have the string puller do is gently apply pressure on the string. You can go ahead and start pulling, and what you want to do here is hold your hand on the sides of the bladder and just make sure it feeds in a flat manner. And you may need to hold the strut as they pull. You just want that bladder to go in as untwisted as possible. Once Wyatt, keep pulling until you see that valve come all the way through There we go, and now you can take a break because we're gonna go over the next 2 steps. First one is gonna be to come over here and you wanna seat your valve. So you're gonna pull your valve completely up through the hole on the Dacron, and you may need to do a little fiddling with this to make sure you get everything exactly right, but there is a lip on this bladder once you get it through, and it's important that that lip ends up locking onto the ring of Dacron, thus securing the valve into place. And it is not always the easiest thing to seat, so be patient, slowly pull and work the Dacron down. At this point I can remove my feeder line because it actually is hindering the alignment here. I'm going to go ahead and just completely pull this off, and I'm going to just keep kind of plying on the valve until what you'll see is there's a lip that actually engages around the Dacron, and once that is all engaged and locked in around the ring of Dacron and that valve feels like it's sitting properly, you can go ahead, take your 1 pump tube, you can put it back over your valve. If you're having a hard time getting it to seat, a little bit of spit can help get this thing slide right on. And then the final step up here at the valve head is to take your valve head closure cover. You're simply gonna open the 2 halves, put them over the latex, making sure that it engages, and snap it closed by pushing the 2 halves together. Now you can see my bladder hose is reinstalled. Next really important step down here is to remember to fold up the tail of the bladder. If you do not do this, you pump up your bladder, this will balloon out and you'll have problems. So all you want to do is take the excess, I would give this thing a little bit of a shake. You can see a fair amount of it went back inside of the bladder. I don't want to lose it, but you want to make sure it's in. And I'm just going to give it a small thirds fold. I'm going to put it inside of the sleeve, and then I'm going to fold the sleeve up, re-velcroing the sleeve in place. Now a lot of this stuff is just by eyesight until we actually put some pressure in this thing and we start to evaluate how things are inflating. And it's really important when we move to this next step, which is inflation, that we take our time inflating the bladder and really ensure that we don't have any twists or that everything's filling out correctly. So I've secured my valve head, I've closed the tail of my strut. I'm hoping I don't have any twists, but we're not going to know. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is going to start pumping up my wing as if I was just going to go out and wing. So close my D plates, grab myself a pump, and I'm just going to start pumping up the wing. Up. Now, as I get closer to the PSI, you're going to see some air starting to move into the strut. And what you want to look for is any negative filled out areas in the strut. So as we get closer with the leading edge pressure, you're going to start to hear some air start to travel into the strut, and all you want to do is go one slow pump at a time and just slowly let that strut start to fill. At this point, it's all about taking your time. Key areas where you're probably going to find some issues are up here at the valve. If for whatever reason you accidentally 360'd the valve when you put it in, you'll see a negative space here against the valve, and you should stop immediately, push the valve in, try to reorient it by turning it. If, like in this case, I see very little negative pressure around the valve, I feel pretty confident that we got a good seal there. I don't see any other spots. You can see maybe a little bit here how this is not quite filled out. So it does feel like there's something going on there. So I'm just gonna give it a little bit of a, while it's not fully inflated, a little bit of a massage, and that should help iron out some of these details. Another really important spot on the dart is to look up here inside of the leading edge. There is a fair amount of space behind the strut, and you want to get your hand in there and make sure the bladder feels like it's filling out that cavity, giving it a nice little wing massage and making sure that your bladder feels like it's filling the area. To me, this feels really solid, and so I feel confident in continuing to apply pressure. Once again, I'm just watching those areas of concern, which is the valve head back here and that spot where I thought I may have had a twist, but you can see that ironed out. There's no issues there. There's still no issues up here in the head, and my valve still looks really good. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this thing up to full pressure, which in the case of this dart is about 6 psi, 6 to 7 psi. Okay, and now, even though I just put a new bladder in here, if you maybe repaired this bladder, it's a great time to clip off the one pump valve, let this thing sit for about 30 minutes, and make sure you don't have a soft strut or a soft leading edge so that your repair took. I'm also going to come down here and I'm going to look at my end cap. Okay, everything looks like it filled out. It's got pressure in the end cap. There's nothing bulging out or looking like it didn't seat well, so that feels good. And then finally, I'll just kind of give it a once visual up in here. Everything filled out really nice. Filled out really nice. No depressions around my valve. Strut feels solid. This thing is good to go.